Earliest use. The earliest records of humans making use of cannabis in one way or another goes back to around 10,000 BCE, and this unique herb with a variety of uses has been identified as the mother plant in the development of the concept of agriculturalism, a major component in the birth of human civilization. Popular opinion amongst contemporary scholars on the subject places this as being a Central Asian innovation, as has certainly been done on a large scale when there has been any connection to early human development in ancient Africa. But the construction of the Sphinx about 2,000 years after this date in present-day Egypt strongly indicates the existence of a fledgling civilization functioning for a significant amount of time before that great statue of a humble lion with the head of a Nubian ancestor was chiseled into being. As Sheikh Anta Diop stated on the subject in his book The African Origin of Civilization, 1974. The birth of Egyptology was marked by the need to destroy the memory of a Negro Egypt. To further illustrate this point, in referring to and discrediting the theories that had been developed by Eurocentric scholars promoting the idea that civilization had been carried by Asians into Northeast Africa, he goes on to write. When the calendar was definitely in use in Egypt, Mesopotamia was still building with sun-dried bricks made of clay. Historical evidence shows that there can be no doubt that human civilization was first introduced in the northeast region of Africa, encouraged by the climate and seasonal conditions affecting the surrounding environment of the long-flowing Nile River running north from Greater Nubia, possibly as far south as the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, into the Mediterranean Sea. It therefore follows that with agriculturalism being one of the main components in the developing and structuring of an organized and civil society, their main crop going back to pre-dynastic times must have been cannabis, which it is known they used in the treatment of various ailments but particularly in relation to those that brought blindness in old age. It also played a role in early religious rites, its psychoactive effects when ingested representing a spiritual connection to the ancestors and other revered deities being made. Legends exist stating that cannabis was found growing on the yet unfound grave of the biblical King Solomon. In actual historic records, traces of the mystic herb have been found in the tombs of several pharaohs. Over the following millennia, its use would spread across Asia and into Eastern Europe, with the hemp plant being used for a variety of purposes including for the making of paper, cloth, oil, and medicine. As the hemp plant moved into the northern hemisphere, its psychoactive properties generally identified as being THC became less pronounced and its use in those regions was directed away from its associated spiritual practices. Indeed, hard as it might be to imagine today, over most of the time that humans have been around, the use of cannabis has not been restricted in any large-scale significant way until very recently, when compared with the 12,000 years of recorded human contact with the herb. Introduction of prohibition. The earliest known incidence of prohibition took place in Arabia towards the end of the 14th century CE when an emir in one of the territories there banned its use within his province, probably in line with his religious beliefs with regards to intoxication. Ironically, cannabis use within the region would increase significantly over the next 2 decades. As the Europeans started developing their colonies in the Americas during the 16th century CE on the back of their slave economy, the Spanish began to encourage the cultivation of hemp across their claimed territories for the manufacturing of ropes and cloth to use as ship sails. Their African slaves, familiar with its use in their traditional religious rites, would make use of its psychoactive properties, being both restricted or tolerated to varying degrees dependent on the will of the individual slave master. The English followed suit in the following century when they started to set up colonies in North America and the Caribbean, with the hemp becoming accepted and recognized as an important cash crop. Its production in the Americas doing some damage to the Russian trade in what was known as industrial hemp, the strain that had less psychoactive properties than the variety found in the tropical regions. The second known instance of cannabis use being outlawed came towards the end of the 18th century CE in Madagascar, when the newly instated king there, having just ousted his uncle in a coup, made its ingestion a crime punishable by death. Despite this law being in place, the extent to which it was enforced is questionable, as it had little or no effect on cannabis use within his territory. Napoleon's invasion of Syria and Egypt at the end of the 18th century CE saw the issuing of a ban on its use placed on his soldiers, who had begun importing cannabis and no doubt other opiates back into France. Portugal introduced hemp farming into the slave economy of its Brazil colony early in the 19th century CE, and the slaves there quickly began using it for its psychoactive properties in the practice of their traditional rituals brought with them from Africa. The obvious non-Christian aspects attached to such ritualistic behavior led the Portuguese authorities to ban its use by slaves in 1830. Post-slave era. Britain entered the world of cannabis prohibition almost immediately after abolishing slavery in its colonies in 1837. As a result of the changing climate in labor demands within its colonies after the abolition of slavery, Britain began transporting indentured workers from India to work throughout its empire to tackle the difficulties being experienced. These Indian workers, who became known as coolies, brought with them the practice of importing and using cannabis, referred to as ganda in a legal document from British Mauritius in 1840, which the colonial authorities there had begun to look upon unfavorably, banning its use. It is worth noting that the other British-controlled territories were not affected by this ruling, as it appears that Mauritius was granted a greater level of autonomy, allowing it to bring in such measures without the British government feeling obliged to do so across the other colonies where the so-called coolies were being shipped to. By the mid-19th century CE, the United States pharmaceutical authorities had approved cannabis as a treatment for several ailments and diseases, all tending to be in relation to at least one of the following causes: aging, infected deep wounds, contaminated food, water, or air, and depression or conditions relating to anxiety. Going into the 20th century CE in the United States, cannabis formed part of the ingredients in a variety of over-the-counter medicines, but attitudes would soon start to change with the arrival of Mexican immigrants who were smoking the herb recreationally. The general feelings of dislike towards the Mexicans in the United States led to cannabis being labeled the Mexican menace by anti-drugs campaigners, and the authorities started to take steps to tighten up on its use. First, the Food and Drugs Act, 1906, specified that all products containing cannabis be labeled appropriately, and then with the outbreak of the Great War in Europe in 1914, several of the states of America had started passing laws individually, banning the use of cannabis. The British colonial authorities in Jamaica, taking its lead from the International Opium Convention of 1912, which was concerned with controlling the import and export of morphine and cocaine, unilaterally introduced the same controls with regards to cannabis, effectively criminalizing its export from the island beginning in 1913. The same or similar prohibition policies were introduced in South Africa, United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Canada during the early 1920s. The New World Order. In 1924, a variation of the dangerous drugs law introduced in Malaysia, a British colony, a few years prior, to control and ban the use of morphine and cocaine, was passed in Jamaica, designed to allow the colonial authorities to increase penalties for cannabis use. By 1925, the League of Nations agreed a decree recommending cannabis be considered an addictive drug, with its production and use to be restricted and criminalized globally. Half of the states of America had by then passed laws prohibiting the use of cannabis, and the Great Depression that followed starting in 1929 brought even deeper resentment towards the Mexican migrants who had continued to arrive. Driven by racial prejudice and fear, many Americans felt that the Mexicans were coming and taking their jobs, and because of its association with the Mexican community, cannabis use became more stigmatized. Its added association with African American jazz musicians and entertainers who were becoming quite popular, served to further fan the flames of disapproval. Propaganda started to be spread linking cannabis use with crime, violence and insanity, and the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by the openly racist Harry J. Anslinger, began a campaign to criminalize the use of cannabis nationally, targeting blacks and Latinos. By 1936 all the states in America had passed laws banning the use of cannabis, and in the same year an anti-cannabis public information propaganda film called Reefer Madness was made. In the early 40s doctors began to discredit the medicinal benefits of cannabis, and despite academic reports being published finding it to be no more than a mild intoxicant, Anslinger would continue to be determined to attack such claims aggressively. The 1952 Bot Act passed strict mandatory punishments to be a penalty linked to the use of cannabis in the United States. The Jamaican political leader Alexander Bustamante had already developed an anti-cannabis position, associating its use with crime and insanity, possibly because of his involvement as mayor of Kingston during the 30s, in the hunt for the infamous one-man crime wave known as Bunny Regin. With the growth of the Rastafarian movement during the late 40s and early 50s came even harsher penalties under his leadership, including imprisonment for possession. The arrival of independence for the island in 1961 was only an opportunity for the now Prime Minister Bustamante to act with even more brutality towards the Rastafarians and the cannabis herb. Counterculture and change. The counterculture of the 60s in the US saw cannabis looked upon favorably by students, hippies, and free spirits etc., and a Kennedy government-commissioned report found cannabis did not induce violence and was not a gateway drug to other more dangerous substances. Kennedy's assassination would come before he would get a chance to take any further significant steps in relation to this, and the crackdown on its use would persist on the state level throughout the late 60s, with 10 times more arrests for possession and distribution made during this period. The Nixon government would harden laws against cannabis use in 1970, fitting it into the same category of penalty as being issued for heroin and LSD, whilst in the Netherlands they would take an alternative approach, moving towards the introduction of decriminalization for cannabis in 1976. This happening as interest in the benefits of medicinal cannabis grew during the 70s, and its most vocal advocate was the Jamaican reggae singer Peter Tosh, who, backed by Rolling Stone's promotional platform and profile, produced a couple of what would become pro-cannabis anthems, including the underground hit Legalize It. Some states in the US eventually started moving towards decriminalization of the herb, and California would become the first state to legalize cannabis for medical purposes in 1996. Canada would follow the example of California, becoming the first nation-state to do so in 2001. Portugal went a step further by decriminalizing all drugs in the same year. In 2013, Uruguay became the first country to declare cannabis legal to use for recreational purposes. Closing statement. In conclusion, the many ways that cannabis can be used made this herb the ideal plant for cultivation by humans 12,000 years ago, its essential status in pre-civilization Nubia making its habitual use amongst the more senior in their society an accepted practice. The medicinal benefits that these ancient people recognized it to contain were directed firmly towards sustainability within agedness, symbolizing spiritual knowledge and wisdom, and its psychoactive effects when ingested supported that notion of a spiritual connection to an unseen intelligent force or energy within nature and the universe. With the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, more and more Europeans were finding themselves relocated into the tropical regions of the Americas and being in close contact with black and brown people who would make use of the herb for its psychoactive properties in their ancient traditional rituals, of which many were celebrated annually. Guided by the prevailing notion of the day pertaining towards an ideology of white supremacy and a fear of non-European ancient traditionalism, which they saw as being savage and paganistic, the use of cannabis would become heavily stigmatized, even while at the same time it was available to be purchased in over-the-counter medicines. The abolition of slavery during the 19th century CE would see the introduction of legal penalties for its use, having previously been restricted or not, at the discretion of the individual slave master. These penalties would steadily become harsher over the years and decades going forward into the 20th century CE, targeting the non-white communities and those seen as being society dropouts. An anti-cannabis propaganda machine was developed, with even the League of Nations delivering a recommendation for the cannabis hemp plant to be banned globally. But it should be noted that at this point in history almost all the tropical and southern hemisphere regions of the world were operating under European colonial rule and control. The continued prohibition of cannabis that persisted throughout the 20th century CE and even into the present 21st century CE, even against evidence suggesting it should be ceased, was driven by racism and the ideology of white supremacy, serving as a pretext by which non-white individuals could be viewed with suspicion and easily prosecuted or locked up, whether in the prisons or in the asylums. The present situation in relation to cannabis and its illegality in various parts of the world is in desperate need of adjustment, and it should fall on the United Nations to publicly acknowledge the scientific evidence in relation to its medicinal benefits and recreational use. Nation-states of the world that haven't already done so should be encouraged to fashion their laws in a way that legitimizes the use of cannabis in medical treatments and in traditional religious or spiritual practices. Secularism in practice would also demand that recreational use, even if with certain restrictions, for example age, decriminalization, or licensing, should become an accepted or at least tolerated practice without penalties.
When I sip your cup, you come alive.